Doug's going to be talking about from zero to prod and using the Jamstack to quickly get things out. So I'm really excited about this. Doug, Whitney, go ahead and take it away.
Just a quick note here. If you have questions for Doug, I'll be feeding them through the Twitch chat, so just submit them there once he's done speaking.
Yes, thank you, Zach. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Doug.
Cool, thank you guys. Okay, you can see my screen. Cool. So, hello everybody, hope you're having a good evening. I am going to be talking tonight about my recent experience using GatsbyJS. I have done, a lot of front-end development over time, but this was my first experience with this particular tool, and it was really great to work with, which is why I'm speaking about it tonight. So as Thomas mentioned, I am a UI engineer for a company called MetaRouter, and we are based mostly here in Denver. The project that I'm going to be talking about and using as an example is our public documentation website, and I'll share that a little bit later. So one of the challenges with content-driven websites is that there are many interested parties with different needs. As a developer, you you don't want to have to fight against a framework or some homegrown system in order to make changes when someone who doesn't have the technical skills requests that updates be made, and you find yourself dealing with work that maybe somebody else did or that you did yourself a long time ago and has just kind of gotten stale over time. As an author, you want an easy way to write content and have it be formatted in the way that you expect and have it look good when it is actually published to your end users. And for those visitors, similarly, you want a website where you can find what you're looking for, that has a clean, usable layout, and that focuses on the content. And of course, for search engines, there are different needs there. Some overlap with user needs, but there are some specific concerns when it comes to optimizing things for search engines. So that's where Markdown comes into the picture, in particular for non-technical authors. Over time, a few of the most popular options have been WYSIWYG editors and maybe more recently Markdown, in part because it has proven to be a durable format over time. It converts easily to HTML. It is portable and self-contained, but it also has an informal spec with many different implementations depending on where you are using Markdown, which tool you're using to parse it. Some of the other benefits of Markdown are that it is readable from the author perspective. It focuses on the content rather than the formatting or surrounding tags with HTML structure, and also requires no knowledge of HTML to generate structured documents. And the structure that is output when you convert Markdown to HTML is also beneficial to users and search engines in terms of the hierarchy that it creates. In terms of portability, it's easy to take Markdown files and move them from one framework to another, and again, because they are self-contained. So in this example, in the site that I'll be talking about, this migration was from Jekyll to Gatsby, just starting with the content and building from there. And oftentimes it is the content is the only thing that really survives kind of multiple versions or design changes. Markdown also provides a way to embed metadata in your files. Front matter is the typical format, which I think was popularized by Jekyll, where you are using YAML syntax to describe different pieces of data. It's very free form in that you can use any valid YAML syntax, but it is brittle by nature. There's no predefined functionality in metadata other than it's just data that you can make use of given various tools that can parse it and access it. But there is no real schema to speak of when you are adding front matter or metadata to a Markdown file. No way to validate or enforce field names or types or values or any of those kind of things. So when it comes to consuming the metadata programmatically, it is definitely important to be defensive in how you handle that and surface useful error messages if there are problems with the front matter, because as an author or even as a developer trying to figure out why new content has broken the site, it can be very hard to track those things down. And GatsbyJS is one of many tools that can make use of Markdown content and generate a static site from those files. What is great about Gatsby from my perspective is being able to use familiar tools. If you've worked with JavaScript before, either on the client side or the back end, you are writing React components, which are built and run in a Node.js environment, either locally on your machine during development or on a CI/CD system where it is able to build with Node.js. And it outputs a static website, which is optimized for search engines, but when JavaScript is available, it acts as a progressive web app, doing things like preloading links that are likely to be visited next based on an algorithm that is, I think, somewhat unique to Gatsby. So the steps for getting started with a Gatsby website are pretty straightforward, and also I think one of the strong points of the framework is that it's very easy to Okay.
I can hear him okay. Yeah, I can hear him okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. Sorry about that.
Okay. No worries. Whoops. Okay. So as I was saying, the steps to get started with a Gatsby website are very straightforward. And I think that's one of the strong points of Gatsby as a framework, is that it's very easy to get something up and running quickly that you can iterate and build on. So the first step is to globally install the Gatsby command line tool, which will let you run commands like creating a new website and changing into that folder, and then starting the dev server, and then you can visit that dev site on your local host. The next step is to add Markdown content. So within the file structure that Gatsby generates, there is a source directory, and within that you really can create a directory using any name that you want, and then within that you can organize your Markdown files however you would like in terms of their names and subdirectories within it. The next step is going to be adding a pair of plugins, and these together enable two things. They automatically expose the metadata from all of the Markdown files as a GraphQL API, and the second plugin here, the Gatsby Transformer, takes Markdown content and transforms it into HTML. A bit of configuration here. So you can see the path for our file system plugin references. In this case, I used a directory called content to hold all of my Markdown files. And you can also see the transformer plugin, which again is used to transform Markdown to HTML. And these are a couple of additional plugins used during that process. Not necessary, but provided some additional capability there. Once you have added Markdown content and installed the plugins and everything is in place that way, the next step is to explore what Gatsby exposes through this GraphQL API. And you can see in the screenshot here that this query is looking at all Markdown remarks. So all of the Markdown files and all of their metadata, which you can see in the results on the right. And with this capability and everything else that comes with GraphQL, it gives you a lot of power to generate site structure, navigation, pages and routing and everything else that goes with the website. So with the API and the content in place and the ability to query your metadata, then the next step is to create pages from that data. So on the left-hand side, you can see an example of the query and the data that is being pulled back from these files. And on the right is a a function that Gatsby exposes called create page. So during the build process, you can do what is shown here, run a query, and generate pages based on those results. So a couple of details here. The path that we're using here can be any field that is available from the front matter, which is really nice. It came in helpful in the case where I used this because I had close to 100 content files which did not have a consistent naming pattern, but luckily the path itself is decoupled from the physical file name. And then the component is the page template that is being used to display these. In my case, I was able to use one template for all of the files, which definitely simplified things. But one thing that I did, which is not necessary, but again, opened up the path to more customizations of the HTML content, was passing it through this context object. So without this, you still would have access to the HTML in this page template. The limitation there is that it is the raw output of the Markdown to HTML conversion. So Gatsby also gives you some hooks where you can do things during the build process. And what we chose to do to this HTML being passed through context was run a bunch of mutations on the content to inject additional HTML in certain cases and just do additional things on the server side before we output the static HTML. Another useful piece here is the ability to be able to generate navigation. So very similar to what we were just looking at for generating pages from a GraphQL query, but in this case, we're interested in a more limited set of fields. And then with the results that we get from that query, you'll notice inside of this list item on the right, we're using a link element, which is a React component provided by Gatsby, which has some special functionality related to what I was mentioning earlier about the progressive enhancements. So these link elements are preloaded using some prefetch logic. So obviously, I've left a lot of steps out, but that is, in its short form, really what is required to get a working website just from a set of Markdown files. It is definitely important, and I skipped over this a bit. I'll come back to it, but it's definitely important to think about what you will need in terms of metadata and get all of that in place so that you are not running into strange errors during the development and build process. But once you have that piece worked out, it is definitely a quick process to get your site in a minimal state that you can quickly iterate and build on. When it comes to getting ready for production, Gatsby gives you quite a few things out of the box. A prod optimized build. The only piece I think that I ended up doing manually was some CSS optimization, just based on the tooling that I chose, nothing to do with Gatsby. But aside from that, it really just consists of running Gatsby build instead of Gatsby dev, and you get a prod optimized output. They also recommend auditing performance with Lighthouse. For the most part, just based on the site structure that Gatsby outputs and the availability of plugins for things like XML sitemap and other things, the site, as we built it, performed well, on our first audit, and didn't require a lot of rebuilding, refactoring, and I think a lot of that credit definitely goes to Gatsby. Of course, some general things, you want to probably optimize assets if necessary. In our case, I did not use Gatsby's kind of responsive image component for a few reasons, in part having to do with the way images were linked locally in the Markdown content. But that is definitely an optimization we could have looked at, and instead we short-term opted to deliver images from a CDN as a starting point. It is very easy, I think, to get your Gatsby site deployed. There are many options. Anywhere you can host a static site will work. Netlify is a good choice if you want some kind of continuous deployment. They make it very easy to set up. You can also do it through GitHub pages or GitLab pages. And if you need to, map your domain to wherever you have it hosted. With a content-driven site like this, there are a couple of things that, of course, you always have to do just to make sure that your content and your links are all in good shape, just as kind of final steps. So as a live example, you can take a look at the site that I built using Gatsby and the public repo behind it. and feel free to see how this particular site was put together. As I mentioned, there are a lot of customizations both in how the HTML output is put together, and also some client-side JavaScript as well. But the final structure of the site that we built and put into production at MetaRouter looks like this. I've removed a few files from the root and some CSS, but this really comprises the entirety of the site. These are, for the most part, React components. You can see that we have a global layout, our homepage, the template that was used in creating pages programmatically. And then we get into a set of files that Gatsby provides, which give you some different capabilities. So Gatsby Browser is where we added our client-side enhancements. Gatsby Node is where you have the opportunity to do things with the Markdown content before the HTML output is finalized. And then Gatsby SSR gives you an opportunity to do a few other things with some APIs that exposes. As I mentioned, one of the prerequisites when getting your content together is figuring out how you're going to use front matter and documenting that. And here is a link to how we did that in this project, and an example of what that looks like using the front matter with YAML syntax. A couple of other things you'll see in the demo repo, in the stack that we used. Prism.js was great for syntax highlighting, and then Gatsby plugins for things like auto-linking headers so that you can deep link to any section of the content. Another piece that I don't believe is directly related to Gatsby, but is supported, is a tool from a company called Algolia, and they provide a free service for any public documentation website where they will index your content and provide an autocomplete UI, and that came in really handy for us because, again, we are talking about close to 100 pages of content, and finding that on the user side and surfacing the right content is always a challenge. And then additionally, you can see how we set up our continuous deployment using GitLab pages. Kind of circling back here and wrapping up, a few things that Gatsby gives you out of the box. You get the dev build with hot reloading, page level routing. So each page generates a URL that users will use to access that page. Makes it really easy. The GraphQL API, the build output that is optimized for visitors and search engines, of course, because it is just static HTML, but then when JavaScript is available, the site acts as a progressive web app and does some magic behind the scenes. And Gatsby's place in the Jamstack, I think, is pretty clear in that you can really do everything that you need from start to finish, just using the kind of core tools and that core Jamstack. And again, very easy to deploy to any kind of static hosting environment. And yeah. Other reasons that I really came to love Gatsby in the time that I used it are that it has a very easy learning curve if you have written JavaScript in really any kind of capacity. And the documentation is very good. a broad set of plugins for different functionality that you might need, and of course it embraces the Jamstack. There are alternatives. The ones on the top are kind of more general purpose. The ones on the bottom are more document focused. In the end, the reason that we chose Gatsby is that it is most similar to our application development stack and just makes switching between those contexts easy. I'm not sure where I would use Gatsby, in part because my work often focuses more on application development, but I think I would probably choose a different tool if I were building a blog or again a web app or some kind of community run site. I think there are probably better niche tools for those needs. A couple of links, and that is all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. One of the things you mentioned kind of at the very beginning, having metadata, since there's no strict format in Markdown specifically, the metadata is sort of it can cause bugs, and you kind of came back to that later of like just checking everything to make sure that there isn't any problems with that, like rendering all your pages. Is there anything, I assume this isn't built into Gatsby, but is there any plugin you've seen, or what's your plan for like, okay, now every single page needs to have this new piece of metadata? Can you do that like programmatically, like when Gatsby loads it in, like add that metadata, or what's the plan for that kind of stuff?
It was definitely a manual process in our case. I think the way that we've talked about it and the best way to enforce that, in the future, is to build a UI around that can, manage those fields and do some validation. But yeah, short of that, you're relying on authors to make sure they don't mistype a field name or do something that will break the entire site.
Yeah. And then also at the end, you mentioned that, use cases where you might not use Gatsby, or like if you want an interactive UI, for example. Does Gatsby have a path for people who want like the statically rendered stuff, but also adding in UI, or is that just sort of like something that's not quite built in?
I think so. I don't have enough experience to answer that question, but I believe so from what I read. As a front-end developer, I really like the idea of server-side rendering, but have found it difficult in practice.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the answer. I know nothing about Gatsby, so everything you know is way more than me. Zach, are there any questions in the Twitch stream?
We do. First off, we got Mick Jeets asking, thanks for your insights on Gatsby, Doug. Always a pleasure. Gatsby is opinionated. Are there any framework decisions you don't agree with? Why or why not?
None that come right to the top of my head. The plugin architecture was pretty easy to work with. There were, like the image component, there were a few things that I just bypassed because I didn't really have time to dig into them and maybe did the hard way. But yeah, for the most part, I found it pretty easy to work with.
Cool. So we got one from Gaberdowski. And this one I'm actually interested in as well. Tailwind is brand new. Some people are wary to test out a barely 1.0 product. Would you recommend it? And I'm curious to hear your thoughts because I really like Tailwind myself.
Yeah, this was the first time I had used Tailwind as well, but I really came to like it. Having used SAS and Less and whatever else, but it was really easy to set up. Worked well with Gatsby and Post CSS, and yeah, I'm actually currently using Tailwind CSS for a component library and having really good results with that.
Nice. Yeah, I like that you can kind of use SAS and other things with Tailwind. It's kind of a cool feature it has to just work with other things. Let's see. We got a Danoplan asking, this all sounded pretty similar to Jekyll, like you noted at the end. Besides being in a language consistent with your stack, does Gatsby do anything better / different than Jekyll?
I don't know. The reason that was mentioned was the biggest reason that we went with it, that it was a familiar stack. Uh, I'm sure Jekyll is equally capable, but yeah, I did not have the experience with working with it directly.
Fair enough. And it was actually Danopian. I cannot read. My apologies. Let's see. We do have a comment from David Legger. Gatsby has all the same functionality as Create React apps, so only client-side dynamic code. If you want dynamic server-side rendering, Next.js is the best choice at the moment, in his opinion, or in their opinion.
Cool.
I think we might have also missed a question from Ryan Bahan.
We did. My apologies there.
That's all right. What are Doug? What are your thoughts on the Gatsby plugin ecosystem? They were saying feels a little bit or a lot like a successor to the WordPress plugin with less hassle. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't know exactly how Gatsby uses Webpack under the hood, but I think from my experience, it's more similar to Webpack plugins, and the plugins that I used, I don't know if they were all developed by the core team, but they were all very high quality, and that's, I think, maybe where the difference between some of the WordPress plugins was for me.
Okay, and I'm going to try and pronounce this name, Keoth. I'm going to say it's Keoth. He says, I was under the impression that Gatsby was favored for creating blogs. Maybe I'm wrong, but what would you choose over Gatsby for a blog?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe someone with more experience can speak to that. But my my experience with blogs has always been with tools like WordPress backed by a relational database. I am sure you can do it with a tool like Gatsby, and I think with some of their commercial offerings coming up, that is maybe where some of that is headed. But I did not dig enough into it given our use case for that.
Makes sense. Not seeing any more questions, but we'll give them a second here.
Doug, just following up on that, do you think maybe the relational database blog experience is more suited to like multi-author blogs versus like if you're a single author, the Gatsby experience can just be, well, it's a markdown file, so one author can just do whatever they want. How do you feel about that kind of difference?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, definitely with things like WordPress and some of their plugins, you can, successfully do user permissions and have the different levels. Again, I think that would be something you would have to do outside of Gatsby if you wanted to build a UI to enforce how people are editing content.
Yeah, I think kind of it depends on what you're using as your content system in that case.
Yeah. That fits very nicely with the Jamstack because you can plug in a bunch of APIs for authorization and content management and all that kind of stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah, it sounds like that's where Gatsby is going with the recent fundraising that they announced here maybe a week ago too, is offering a lot of those services that maybe aren't quite as easy with the static output.
Cool. Well, we don't see any more questions, so I think we're good there.
Cool. Thank you again, Doug.
Thanks,
That was a great talk. Appreciate your insight into that experience. You said at the very end of your talk, you're like, and be home in time for dinner with all this stuff. How long did it take you from like, okay, we have these old markdown files and now we want a site. How long did that actually take you kind of at your job?
It was over the course of probably 6 to 8 weeks from start to finish, but that included, a lot of content editing and cleanup and design work and everything else around that. So yeah, if you have, some existing content and just want to refresh a site, you could definitely do it more quickly.
Awesome. Awesome.